Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. We have a special guest joining us later, but we'll introduce her in a minute. As usual, I'll start off with a little bit of news. What's been going on? Well, quite a lot's been going on, which you might know if you've been following our social media. But there's something that hasn't been on social media as well that I'll mention here. Last Thursday, we joined the protest about the Scottish Government's transgender guidance for schools, which says the teachers should discuss with pupils whether they want to change name, gender, pronouns, and then also ask them if they want to keep that a secret from their parents. So we're protesting about that. A great crowd at the Parliament. I would say, we were about 100 people there, which was fantastic. The placards, we had some speeches. Afterwards, we went up to a pub up the road. We packed out the pub. I would say not many tables left. When we filled up both rooms of it. So that was great. Later on that evening, we had another little incident that you might find very interesting to hear about. We went along to our Edinburgh branch meeting, which we'd booked in a function room in a bar called the Outhouse in the centre of Edinburgh. We subsequently realised, we didn't realise when we booked this, we subsequently realised that this is actually known as, how should we put it, very, very LGBT friendly. Let's put it that way. But we found that out. That doesn't matter. That's fine by us. We can have our meeting in the function room, and we'll just go ahead. That's fine. When we arrived there, 3 of us were there, and they said, we're cancelling the function room. You can't use the function room because we disagree with your values. They don't align with our values. So we said to them, that's probably illegal under the Equalities Act. So we said, eventually, okay, if you're going to stick to your guns, we'll just come and have a drink in the bar, and we'll wait and see who else turns up. And the manager said, and this was standing at the threshold, at the doorway of the bar. He said, no, you can't come in. So we said, we just want to go and sit in the bar, have a drink, and wait and see who comes. No, our staff wouldn't be comfortable serving you. So they refused us access to the bar, basically refused to serve us. Now, I've had a look into this from a legal point of view, and as far as I can tell, it seems pretty likely that they've broken the Equality Act because they've discriminated in the provision of goods and services. And they seem to have gone to the media with it. And Edinburgh Live, a local media outlet, they ran a story of it. And the people at the bar were obviously quite sort of proud of how they were, they had much higher standards, so they wouldn't stoop to serve people such as myself and the other 2 family party people with me. So there we go. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we shall see. Initially, I thought, well, it's not particularly a big deal. But other people, we talked about it last night in a strategy meeting. Other people were saying, well, this is quite important from the point of view of a precedent. Okay, we're not going to claim that we're all psychologically scarred and, we've been depressed ever since. We're not going to play that game. But it'd be quite good to lay down yet another marker to let venues and businesses know that they can't treat people like this. So watch this space. We're taking advice on the issue, and we'll decide how to proceed with this over the next few weeks. So that story will unfold further. Watch this space. Right, what else is in the news? We're going to meet in Ayr tomorrow night at the Market Inn in Ayr at 7:30 p.m. I'll be talking there on various topics. I'll cover some about the transgender guidance for schools. Next week, just a bit of advance notice. On Monday evening, we have a meeting in Dumfries. On Wednesday evening, we have a meeting in Paisley. And on Thursday evening, we have a meeting in Kirkcaldy. So busy week next week. So look on social media. The venues and the times will be there. But it would be great to see you at any of those meetings. Right, I'll just mention next week's guest as well. I'm going to be speaking to next week's guest because, well, we've got stories to swap, quite similar stories in some ways. And we've got Reverend Bernard Randall coming on. Reverend Bernard Randall was the chaplain at an independent school in Nottingham, but he spoke in a chapel service and he said to the pupils, basically, the LGBT message that the school is presenting to you. He said to them, it's okay if you don't completely agree with that. It's okay to have your own opinion instead of just following what the school's teaching you on this issue. And as a result of that, he was fired. from his job there. I think there might be legal proceedings going on. I'm not exactly sure. But we can hear all about that next week. So that's Reverend Bernard Randall on the live stream next week. Right, I've got a couple of little news stories to cover before moving to our guest this week. First one, the census in Scotland next year, people are going to be allowed to self-identify sex, gender, whatever you want to call it. And that will just be the sole data that's gathered in that area. So the census is the government's central, most reliable, most important means of gathering data on the population. And they're basically saying you can just write whatever you like in the sex, gender box, which is just bizarre. Yet another example of the government basically going to transgender activists and saying, please tell us how to run the country. And the transgender activists go, yeah, okay, you need to do this, this, and this. And the government says, right, okay, that's exactly what we'll do. Then they'll come back 6 months later and say, right, what do you want us to do next? So devaluing the census data in this way is pretty extreme, in my view. Now, the government actually held a consultation on this very issue. It'd be 18 months ago, before the lockdowns. And I went to a meeting in this consultation in the records office at the end of Princes Street. And one of the government's statisticians was there talking about it. It was obviously a very clever man, a mathematician, but he just seemed dumbfounded by the discussion about this. The girl, I'm not sure she called herself a girl. Anyway, the girl sitting next to me in the consultation, she was in the process of studying a PhD on how to record data on gender. Okay, a PhD in how to record data on gender. It's bizarre, isn't it? And the whole discussion, you can see the statistician just thinking, what on earth is going on here? None of this makes any sense. I really don't care. I wish it would all just go away. But in the end, they've gone with the transgender activists, and you can just write what you like on the census form. Right, that's another little story you might have missed. This was in the Scotsman. Education experts say curriculum for excellence must be radically simplified. Now, I've spoken about the curriculum for excellence quite a few times. It's the curriculum for all state schools in Scotland. It influences heavily what goes on in independent schools as well. The problem with it is woolly and vague. I mean, it really is dire. I've made videos on it. It's so vague that Education Scotland has had to publish, apparently, I haven't counted them, but apparently 70,000 pages of guidance about what it really means and what you're supposed to do. So now the experts are saying it needs to be simplified. We need to get rid of this guidance. So they still can't see what the problem is. It's not that it needs simplifying. You don't need to get rid of all this guidance. They just need to make the curriculum clear. Just tell teachers what to teach at different stages, which topics to which level, make it a straightforward academic curriculum so the teachers know where they stand, the pupils know where they stand, parents can look at it and see what the pupils are going to be learning. It would be far, far simpler, but it's against their principles. They have to be so progressive that the idea of having a curriculum that tells you what you need to teach when, they think that's much too old-fashioned. It all needs to be vague and woolly. So they're just going around in circles in confusion on the issue. So there's no light at the end of the tunnel in educational debate in the Scottish Parliament at the moment. Right, it's now time to meet our guest for this evening. Before we meet our guest, let's bring on Phil. Phil is the deputy leader of the Scottish Family Party. You'll have seen him on the live stream before. Welcome, Phil. Phil's in Edinburgh. So, yep. And our guest this evening is Susan Mason of the Schoolgate campaign. Now, Susan will explain about that. I won't steal her thunder, but it's very much a movement that we admire, that we're interested in, that we want to learn from. We can certainly compare notes. So Phil's going to have a chat with Susan. Welcome, Susan.
Hello, good to be with you tonight.
Right, great to have you here. Right, I will now retreat and leave Phil and Susan to have a chat. I'll pop up at the end maybe with a question or two. Do put in comments. Let me remember, we've got some comments already. Yeah, so comments come in. I could bring some of them up on the screen for Phil and Susan to interact with as well. So over to Phil and Susan. That's going to be fascinating. Right.
So, hi, Susan. First, I'd like you to introduce yourself, but maybe introduce yourself the way that you would introduce yourself before the Schoolgate campaign started. What was life like before that? How would you describe yourself?
Oh, before that, I would say I was a very run-of-the-mill, ordinary person you'd find in the street. I have one daughter. She's now 16. Obviously, she's younger than that when this has all started. I just been getting more and more concerned about what I'd heard about sex education in schools, which we've had in England for quite a few years now, and quite alarmed at the content there. And then when we heard about the new relationships and sex education regulations that were going to come into force, they also seemed quite alarming in what they were going to be teaching. So I've spent probably several years now trying to understand about what is good sex ed, and what is sexuality, and what influences it, and what is gender. But that all sort of came together, I suppose, when we heard about this new RSC that was going to be coming into English schools in 2020.
And what was the point at which you sort of decided to take a stand? Was it something that sort of built up slowly and you thought, I have to do something? Or was there one thing that sort of just, you saw it and you thought, I need to do something?
Well, it's interesting because I did know people who were very learned about these subjects and sharing lots of information, sort of walking encyclopedias about it. And I knew of people who were lobbying government and talking to the DFE, but nothing much seemed to be happening because obviously ideologically the government was actually sold out to these ideologies. So I thought, we need, if the parents knew what was going to be happening, surely they would take action. Well, that's actually, there was one incident which was relayed to me. There was I think an all-party parliamentary group on education, where a representative of the Values Foundation was talking to an MP, and the Values Foundation lady said, when parents hear about this, they're going to be outraged. It's going to be a real pushback. And the MP said, well, there won't be because they won't know about it. And maybe if there was a point when I heard that conversation relayed to me, I thought, you know what, we've got to get the message out to parents about this.
So there's an element of secrecy in the way that this teaching is done.
Well, it's interesting because you've got three levels here. You've got I always say you've got the law, which is fair and reasonable, and I can read it. There are literally just 5 points that are key in the legislation. That's it. Then there's this whole raft of guidance from the DFE, which is not law, and which can be put into practice or not, depending on the school and what they decide, in consultation with the parents. But then there's what's actually happening on the ground in the schools, and the three things do not necessarily tie up together. So there are certainly some schools where there is no problem whatsoever with the sex ed, probably if they're delivering it to the children, and also the relationships education. But there are definitely instances on the ground. And it sounds like, as far as MPs are concerned, there are certainly some MPs who sort of not speak about this, will not be sharing what's really going on. But yeah, the instances of schools being secretive, not sharing information with parents, which is certainly against DFE guidance, and the consultation is in the law, it's not optional. But we've certainly had very sort of shoddy approaches at consultation. COVID has been used as an excuse not to do it properly anyway, but it can be in name only, and it's just telling the parents, this is what we're doing, like a lumpet, so to speak, which is not obviously the spirit of consultation. And there was one lady in Birmingham very early on, and this is actually even before the RSC regulations came into effect. She was told it was none of her business what the school was going to teach her child about, sex and relationships. So there are definitely groups of MPs, civil servants, head teachers, heads of curriculum in some schools who are hiding this from parents and are not really fulfilling their duty towards parents or the children because they're ideologically committed in a different direction.
So, like in the news a while ago, there was a lot of kind of reporting about groups outside of schools campaigning, I think mostly Muslim groups and things like that, protesting outside the school gates. Would you describe yourself as a protest group or as something different?
No, a Schoolgate campaign does not protest. All we want to do is get the information out to parents. There were 5 sort of aims of the campaign. One was in the early days to make parents aware that RSC was coming. Secondly, to alert them to the potential issues with some of the content. It was to signpost them where necessary to other organisations who could give them help and support. It was to make them aware of their rights, their legal rights, which are considerable. And it was to encourage them to engage in consultation with their schools. Those are the goals. And I thought, well, where can I find these parents? Well, I know one place they're going to be at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's picking their kids up from school. So that is why we went, not actually at the gate, but, close to the schools so that we could leaflet. It was a perfectly targeted campaign. We knew we were putting leaflets directly into the hands of people for whom the content of those leaflets were relevant.
And did you just hand the leaflets out, or did you speak to people and tell them what it was about as you were handing them out? And how did it feel the first time you went out to hand out these leaflets?
Well, I was very nervous. This is not the sort of thing I would usually do at all. I wouldn't say I'm a natural campaigner. I was very grateful that I had someone else with me and guidance to put together, very promptly. We would recommend, that you don't go out on your own. Generally, people would just take a leaflet, but it was always good to be ready to have something to say if there were any questions. There weren't that many conversations, but generally the leaflets were well received, and you would get the one rather vocal person objecting, maybe disagreeing, and we had probably more resistance from the teachers themselves than the parents. I suppose that shouldn't be surprising, really, but I ended up in the deputy head teacher's office with my with my fellow leafleter on one occasion. And they didn't actually know what we were handing out. We were in a public place. We were perfectly within our rights to give out those leaflets or to offer them to parents. They didn't have to take them. But someone had gone back inside the school and complained, or maybe they'd texted, actually, I'm not quite sure, did something like that. So there were several members of staff who came out and accosted my companion, actually, and it was all a bit confused, and they didn't, so we got basically our leafleting got terminated, although by that stage I think most of the parents had gone, and we were taken into the head teacher's office to explain ourselves. So that was a very interesting experience.
To be back in the headmaster's office.
Yes, indeed. So it's kind of a baptism by fire in a lot of ways. Some people might relish such experiences. I can't say that I did, but it helped to hone the message and to hone our practices and procedures very quickly. can assure you.
So were there things that you changed in response to what they said? Were there valid criticisms that they had, or were there things you wanted
Not
to phrase
really.
differently? Or?
All I did was I tightened up my understanding and my legal standing, and from then on, this was very early on. We had guidance to issue to anyone who was going to leaflet in public. It was just a couple of paragraphs, advice, practical advice as just don't cause an obstacle. That's not allowed. Don't be belligerent. And then quoting a few sections from legislation saying why you have an absolute right to give out these leaflets and on this subject.
Yeah, and how did it affect relationships you had? And maybe was this your child's school, and did it affect any relationships with parents, with teachers, with other mums and dads, or any relationships of your child at school?
No, I didn't actually do my child's school. The campaign is a primary school campaign, and she was in secondary by that stage anyway. But what I did find out after I started the campaign is that she herself had an unfortunate experience to do with sex ed when she was in year 6. That's the final year in primary school. It's just really interesting because she came home and she told me half the story. She told both of us, both parents, and that there'd been a nurse come in to explain some things, and the girls and the boys had been sort of taken off into separate rooms and spoken about some various things. That's what she told me, and it came out over 2 years later, after I'd started the campaign, that there had also, when they'd been together, girls and boys in one class, there had been a video shown to them, and there were some children who had been covering their eyes and trying to look away, and were obviously not comfortable with this. And this is a very clear indication that it was not age appropriate. Now, as far as I'm aware, I was never consulted. I was never told there was a sex ed class, which is required by law, and neither was I consulted on the sex ed policy. So I discovered, after the fact that the school had basically broken the law with regard to my own child. But I'll just make that clear. That was not my motivation to do this, but it just really brought it home to me. Yes, it is that school down the road. It is that school around the corner. It's a nice little C of E school, supposedly, and you really cannot tell.
Yeah, and I think the situation in Scotland is that we've got the rshp.scot, and these are curriculum resources. And so kind of the same material is probably being taught in most schools. Now, it's probably similar to what you've said in England, where you have the guidelines. And the guidelines, it would be possible for somebody to teach something which is okay within those guidelines. But then the sort of government example of what you should teach is it basically teaches primary school children how to have sex in, fairly graphic ways. And then you'll have some schools where there's activists who will push the boundaries, even further. Richard, do you want to just bring up the BBC article? So this was something that caught my eye. I think it was just yesterday in the news. It says that reports of sex abuse between children has doubled in 2 years. And when you sort of scroll down on it, you see it says that it's gone from sort of 8,000 reports of, and these are reports to the police, of sexual abuse within schools to 16,000. And then it says that 10% of these cases, the alleged abuser was 10 years old or under. So that's 16,000, and that's just the cases which are reported to the police. So, you'd imagine that the cases that aren't reported are much higher. You can take that off now, Richard. And I think that's the worry. Like my daughter's 9 years old. and her ambition is to do whatever teenagers do. You know, that she will see teenagers doing something and she'll think, right, that's what I have to do in order to grow up. And so, you know, when this is being presented to children, it seems obvious that it's going to lead to the things that we're seeing.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the fact that it's being, I mean, you're much younger than me, but I recall that my sort of sex ed was just the national curriculum, which was one science class in secondary school, and I think it was the second one. There was nothing. There were no images whatsoever. It was just a talk, you know. And what we've done is we've pushed the boundaries lower and lower and lower. You know, right, as I say, just even going to the top of primary school, I would not consider appropriate anyway. But yeah, so but what it says to the child really is this is okay. That's really what it's saying. And there are no moral values tied to this. It is, you know, described purely, you know, as a sort of biological thing you do. Oh, when you're ready, that's it. That's determinant, and it is woefully inadequate, and it is irresponsible, quite frankly.
Yeah, and the conflict for me as a parent is that, you know, I'm a Christian, and so within Christian teaching, you know, Jesus said, like, whoever even looks with lust has committed adultery in their heart, you know, and it is in danger of hell, you know. And I appreciate that you know, most people wouldn't believe that, or lots of people wouldn't believe that. But in terms of like what we'd be teaching at home in terms of, you know, to our kids, and then what they're teaching in school, you know, like the videos that Richard has showed are things saying like pornography is great. That's there in our education, and this presentation of sex, which has, you know, for us when we learned about sex, it was to do with biology. It was in biology. It was in the science lesson, and this moving it into the relationship section causes them to teach about all sorts of relationships that, as a Christian, I'd see as inappropriate. They'd not be what I would be teaching my child, and so there's this thing of like the teachers are saying, this thing that your faith says is not okay, we're saying is okay, and it's completely harmless, you know. And for me, I'm like, that's not right. You know, you're actually taking our authority as parents away, and you're teaching something that contradicts what children are being taught at home. And that's going to lead to confusion, or leading children to have to choose between their parents and their teachers, which is going to be a recipe for conflict.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's sort of implicit in it is that parents are not the right people to teach their children about these matters. But that is what they have done ever since the beginning of humanity. All of a sudden, overnight, they have been deemed incompetent, inadequate. But what it really is about is it's politically driven.
And it's not like the animal kingdom, you know, struggles to work out how to have sex. You know, that you don't find that bees would struggle to work out what they had to do, or horses or anything like that. And this idea that, you know, what's surprising is the amount of volume that they need on sex education in schools. You know, that you would think that it was you know, fairly obvious how things worked, but
yes, yeah, it's not. You're crediting these people with sort of benign motives, and I would challenge that. It's not about helping children to understand. You know, it is. It is a form of grooming, really, because I say if you push down the boundaries and push against the natural modesty that children have,
yeah,
and dismantle it, and almost say it's wrong to have that.
Mm.
You're basically socially engineering.
And this is something like, as I've been involved in youth work in churches, and, there have been cases where like children have been abused in churches or been abused in care and schools and all these kind of things. And so everybody who works with children has to go through child protection training. And so I've been through lots of courses, but one course I went through, it detailed the case of a couple of children, and they were abused, but the way that they were abused was that they were invited round to somebody's house. That person showed them pornography, which desensitized them, and after that they were abused. And it seems like that's what's happening in schools, is that desensitization. Like if you had taken children into your home and shown them these images and started talking to them about this stuff, then that was the thing that we should be ringing alarm bells about, that we should be calling in social work about. These were the things that were the signs that a child was about to be abused. And the really sad thing in that case study was that these two children were from a fairly good background and things like that, but the boy, when he grew up, he went on to abuse others, and so this kind of cycle of abuse started there. And I think we see that with the news report that we've just been looking at, is that this is opening the eyes of kids because it's presenting sex outside of any sort of moral framework. And in the Scottish kind of guidance, it says this is what a man does and this is what a woman does. The man will experience great pleasure. The woman will experience great pleasure. It's certainly saying that this is something which is pleasurable. This is something which is nice. And it doesn't give any reason why you might not want to, And, I get this with my daughter at school, is that she's starting to hear swear words now and things like that, and her question will be to me, what are some other swear words, Daddy? What are, the nice thing has been up to this point that because she hasn't known the swear words, she hasn't been going around like swearing at everybody. But now that she knows that such things exist, she's sort of curious about them. And that opens up the way for her to swear and all these kind of things, and I think as we're teaching primary school children how to have sex, the inevitable thing is going to be that some of them do in primary school.
Yes, well, kids are curious, inquisitive. They've had the green light from their teachers. This is all, go for it. This is a good thing to do. So I think it's unsurprising. I didn't know about those figures. I knew 2 years ago when the RSC was first being trialled in various early adoption schools, that already with the sex ed, that child-on-child sexual assault had increased to that point. So it sounds like it's it's doubled again since then. And as you say, they're only the reported incidents. So I don't really know what sort of stats or what sort of scientific evidence is going to be required to make the difference. Well, I do know there's going to be nothing. What it's going to take is something completely different to change the course of education in this respect.
And something I looked at your site, the Schoolgate campaign site, and I saw a video on there that was saying that this is not just Scotland, it's not just England. This is actually something which is happening worldwide, and through kind of foreign aid, poor countries are being bullied into having exactly the same kind of education. They're being told, you won't get your foreign aid unless this is what you're teaching in school. Yeah,
it's at the level of the United Nations. It's supported by the World Health Organization. these organisations do not have your best interest at heart in these matters. They certainly do not have your child's interest. The programme is called Comprehensive Sexuality Education, and there are a few sort of key things that are said on. There's a very short video there that they just make your hair stand on end. But what we're seeing is different countries are just basically delivering their version of it, it's basically an international move, an international push.
And what would you say to the person who's a parent? Maybe they're sitting at home, they're kind of aware that this is going on in the background. They've heard bits and pieces here and there, and they maybe feel a bit like a frog in a pot. What would you say to them? You know, they know something's wrong. They don't know what to do. What should they do?
Well, you need to think strategically about dealing with this. As I say, the evidence is obvious. You know, obviously, it shows that this is not the way to go. Scientific study shows this is not the way to go. I think there are two ways that we can address this, and the first is that parents will need to engage. In England, they have this legal requirement to consult, but where that fails, and it may do, there have been legal cases that have happened.
I understand that you actually go on some human rights law here. Is that right? That you say that that the human rights of the parents are being violated because there's a legal requirement that they should have some input to the way that their children are educated.
Well, so the Human Rights Act of 1998. So we're going way back. To paraphrase, says that parents have a right to have education for their children that is in accordance with their own philosophical or religious beliefs. That's being completely ignored. So while there are legal cases, so common law, that have had some success, the legislation is being ignored if it doesn't suit parties involved. So what is needed is a grassroots movement. It does need parents to mobilise, which is to some extent what the Schoolgate campaign was about. Obviously, it got brought to an end March last year with schools closing because of COVID, and just confusion about what was and wasn't allowed. If you've got a social distance, you certainly can't give someone a leaflet, you know. So that kind of stopped the offline campaign in its tracks. So there are two things. One is mobilisation of parents, and this is not a task for the faint-hearted. One parent in a school trying to stand up to the head, they'll just get picked off. And there was some terrible guidance issued by the Department for Education in, I think it was either September or October of 2019. Now, they issued this privately to local authorities initially, but it was leaked and there was tremendous pressure for them. And in the end, they published it. And it was basically making out that there were these wicked parents who might want to organise, talk to each other, and oppose some of the relationships or sex education that's being brought into their schools, as was their right. And it was really quite shocking. There was even mention of bringing the police in against parents, which was completely, there was no legal foundation for that whatsoever. But basically, the DfE was using school staff to be their boots on the ground to make sure that parents weren't taking action, or if they did it, it was just dead in the water. So the question really is: are there enough parents who care enough about their children to count the cost where it's required to take a stand? And the jury is out on that in England, and I don't know whereabouts you are in Scotland on that. That's
I'm just going to bring out the question on the screen. It says, what advice would you have to parents in regard to what they can and cannot say? I think a lot of people don't want to speak against these things as they fear for their jobs, etc. And I think it's actually a really hard topic to raise. It's because it's like it's the last thing you want to talk to another parent about, is to say, I want to talk about, sex with you, and I want to raise all these things, show you some graphic images and these kind of things. How do you get over that? What do you say? What should people say to schools as well? Should they be writing to schools and making requests and things like that?
Yeah, well, I can speak about the RSC regulations, which they do require schools to consult, as I said, and parents are supposed to have input into the policy and the guidance. One of the good things about the guidance is that samples are supposed to be shared with the parents, so they get a good idea of what's going to be taught to their children. And where that happens, happy days, and hopefully there is an open and honest discussion going on with the schools, and the school will take note, because one of the requirements in the legislation is that any education about this subject should also have in mind the age appropriateness of such education, and also the religious background of the pupils and their families. And this is often being totally disregarded. But that is what the law says in England. And I'm not quite sure what the specifics are of the legislation in Scotland, whether they have that sort of a. If you do, then you need to use it. And so you're breaking the law. This is what I think. And also, don't go in by yourself. Find others who think the same. You have to have courage here. Look, my vocation, my job is an accountant. Do you think this is what I would choose to do? Absolutely not. But if you feel strongly enough about it and care enough about your kids, this is what you will maybe need to do, and just be courageous about it.
And that's a good first step, isn't it, to ask what's being taught in the school. And if the school isn't willing to share it, isn't willing to share the materials, if they just give you a few headings or something like that, that should alert you that something is not quite right. If they feel uncomfortable sharing what they're sharing with your children,
Very good warning signals. Now, the other thing in England is that the policy that is decided upon needs to be made available to anyone who asks. So they don't even need to have a child in the school, and they can ask. That it is a legal requirement that the school provides a copy of that policy. So I would think in Scotland that schools also have policies shown on their websites. So you may not need to directly ask the school. You can just go to the website and find that out. If it's not there, when will they be consulting on it, and so on.
Yeah, and I'd say if you're listening to the live stream, and this is an issue that you're saying, I'd like to take a stand on, why not drop us an email? Because we'll probably try and get together some resources, and we'll probably chat with the Schoolgate campaign as well, and then maybe it'll be something where people can stand up across the country at the same time, and you can have the support of knowing others that are doing it. But we'd love to hear from people who are saying, this is an issue that I want to stand on. And we were quite surprised actually going to the transgender protests this week, that so many people turned up. Richard mentioned we had a branch meeting after it or that evening, and the turnout to the protest was so much higher than a family party members going to the protest as to coming to our branch meeting. And so I think there's a lot of people who actually want action, who want to get involved, get their feet on the ground, and if that's something that, if you think, I'd like to stand in my area on this issue, and I'd maybe like to gather together some parents and things like that, and see something happen where I live, we'd love to hear from you. Why don't you talk a bit about the tone of the campaign? Is there a tone that you've aimed for as a campaign?
Well, just tried to be very even-handed and just point out the blatantly obvious, be very common sense and calm. I start to sort of get a bit more passionate as I go along, because I get, you start to think about all the abuses. But yes, the leaflet itself just has one sort of point to make, one about sex, one about sexuality, and one about gender. And they are sort of fair. Any fair and reasonably minded person would agree with him. And I think, Bill, what you'll find is the majority of people would not be happy with what is going on. But they're often the silent majority, and they need to find their voice.
Yeah, and I think it is that thing that often the people with the loudest voices are sometimes the people who are the least articulate, or but when you see somebody who's just a normal mum or a dad, and they're taking a stand on an issue, and they're plucking up their courage to do it, and it's obvious it's not the sort of thing that they'd normally do. I think Susan said, you've not been involved in other campaigns, you've not been political or anything like this. It was just that this issue touched you deeply, and it caused you to say, I have to do something because nobody else is, Yeah.
I will just say there was one other thing I did do before, just hands up. I did actually, on the coattails of my husband, I stood actually for UKIP in a borough election in 2015. That's probably what got my feet wet, if you like. So I will just put my hands up, but I hadn't done anything else, and that was only because my husband. I was going to make the tea. That's what I was going to do, and somehow I ended up standing. But that's a long story. But so it's amazing what you could end up doing.
Yeah. Another question here. It says we sometimes find people won't believe what's being taught. Have you found that as well? And the problem I have with this material is that, even the primary school stuff, I don't want to share it with adults because I don't think it's good for them. A lot of it, that it's not helpful. What's being shown? It's basically you're sharing pornography with parents if you share this material.
Yes, we mustn't be squeamish because they're showing it to your kids. So you need to take courage there and just bite the bullet, because it's not going to stop them doing this stuff behind closed doors. Yeah.
Are there any other things that you'd like to raise or draw our attention to?
Well, I would just say this. I think there's one other strategy that I think is very helpful, which is not such high profile, but I would really recommend it, and that is. It's actually the ideas that change society. It's the idea, and here we're moving away. We talk mainly about sex ed here, which is very important. But yes, there is also the sort of the celebration, and trying to attempt to normalise alternative sexualities and sort of gender dysphoria. And what can combat this more than the stat and the research and the clinical experience and all of it? That's true and valid. That all gets ignored. Stories of people who have moved away from same-sex attraction, and stories of people who have moved away from being transgender or have transgender regret. And again, it's not for the squeamish. Sorry, Phil, but I thought we need to have courage here to look at these things and listen to these stories, and in fact it's actually very helpful in order to understand people's situations. And there are specific resources that we can look at for that. There was a feature-length documentary produced a couple of years ago. It's called, very appropriately, Voices of the Silenced. And it has an explanation of some of these things, and it has the stories of quite a few people, mainly who've moved away from same-sex attraction. There may be one or two people who talk about gender as well. And there is an organisation called Core Issues Trust that will offer counselling for people who wish to move away from same-sex attraction. And there is a book that is about to be published. It doesn't seem to have a title yet. It's just called The Book, and it's about emerging ex-LGBT voices. That's the book. That's what it's going to be about. And the aim is to give that to every single MP copy to every single MP and basically to circulate it far and wide. And the organisation or the group that is producing that is a group called X Out Loud. And they are a group of primarily young people who are from all over the world. And I highly recommend that we support this group of extremely courageous people. You know, they get such abuse from the LGBT lobby, and they have the courage to record their stories because they want to help others who are in a similar situation. But what it does is it demonstrates the lie to the born gay claim, which is not true, and anything that would say gender dysphoria is not something that the vast majority of children grow out of as they move into adolescence. These two things we need to absolutely counter.
I'm working on a leaflet on conversion therapy at the moment, and really it just strikes me that, you know, conversion therapy, they say, like, covers both gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction, and it's like we're being asked to believe that you know, sex is something that is not assigned at birth, and sexuality is something which is assigned at birth, you know, and it seems illogical to claim those two things at the same time, you know, and to say that anybody who thinks the opposite of that is basically, you know, a criminal, you know. And yeah, so I'm going to be looking into that issue a bit and maybe speaking on some of those things coming up. Well, Susan, thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you tonight. And I hope that we can tell you about things happening in Scotland, and we'll have something to report back with people standing at the gate and taking up this cause.
Yeah, thanks very much, Susan. That was fascinating. I've got a couple of questions. Can I chip in a couple as well? The leaflets that you give out at the Schoolgate, it's making points about like national education policy. I assume it's not suggesting anything specific about that school, about the resources used in that particular school.
Yeah, what happened was this was produced before we'd seen any of the new programs. So I based it on the general principle of the regulations plus content from existing sex ed programs. So when I said these things will be taught, I knew they were already being taught, quite frankly. It was actually based on a research project done in 2016 by the Christian Institute, and they are extremely meticulous. So I can, you know, I know for sure that those were absolutely correct.
And Richard, we saw a victory on this issue, didn't we, in terms of the sex education curriculum and the way it was being taught in the Highland Islands?
The Western Isles Council rejected the government's sex education resources for use in their schools. I mean, basically, as a result of the Scottish Family Party communicating what was in them, then a couple of councillors brought the issue to the fore within the council. There was a lot of parental support for it. So that was, so they rejected it. Well, it should have been a national news story. But we find the media are absolutely allergic to this issue. And we commissioned an opinion poll last year about the Scottish Government's sex education resources. Overwhelming public opposition to several aspects of them, which is obviously a news story, but no one would touch it. It's like it's a real taboo in the media. I don't know what they're so scared of. Is that your experience as well? Have you tried to get media coverage?
Well, yes. What happens usually is they'll try and undermine you or discredit you. I remember when I was interviewed by the BBC, and it was very early on. It was absolute baptism by fire because I knew they were not on board, and I knew it was just, well, what are they going to try and get out of me so that they can then cut and paste it and misrepresent what I'm saying. So it is like going into the lion's den with a lot of the mainstream media. I would agree with that.
Yeah. We were involved in a little, it was a panorama program, to be honest. And a member of the family party was interviewed, and they asked a question: and then like cut and pasted in an answer to another question, and then broadcast that. So that's what she'd said. It's just outrageous. A couple of things. Could you say to Mel Kelly on the comments? Mel Kelly's been in the process of writing a book for us in the comments. I've been reading it. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thanks very much for that. Now, in terms of what we'd like ideally, I've always thought, sex education could be better. I've been a teacher. I've taught sex education. And in my humble opinion, I feel that the sex education that I presented, what was helpful and positive. But other people take the line that the goal should really be for the schools to just keep out of it completely and leave it to parents. But which would you prefer in an ideal world?
Well, personally, I support probably the national curriculum, which is the biology class in secondary school. Well, that was my experience, and I very much support parents, taking aside their child and the right time and in the right way, teaching them about the birds and the bees. I don't think it's something to sort of apply sort of a one size fits nobody. In a mixed class of boys and girls, I mean, it's just outrageous, and the sort of age of development can vary up to 2 years, sort of 24 months in any particular year group as well. So it's and I've heard of so many cases of abuse as well, where kids have really been let down and misled or whatever. Yeah.
I think I'll probably tend to agree. Let's imagine that the Scottish Family Party holds the balance of power, and we go into a coalition with the SNP under the condition that I'm made the Education Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Education. Right, so if I got that job and said, right, here's the relationships and sex education curriculum, this is what needs to be taught, I think it would be futile, because the resistance within the teaching profession, I know some teachers are not on board at all with what's being taught, but so many are that I think it would be virtually impossible to turn things around in that way. So I think just cutting it out might be the only practical solution in the shorter term. But someone just brought that up recently. That made me think. Right, our time has flown. Phil, have you any, or Susan, any last things to throw in? I know you're sort of tied up.
I think that maybe one point is just seeing this called relationship education and seeing that it barely mentions marriage anywhere. That it's really not taking the problem that that there's high numbers of divorce and family breakdown and saying, how do we teach people to be a good partner to somebody? It just does. It's like, these are your sexual rights. You have the capacity to have pleasure. Here are the ways that you can do it. Let no one deny you any of these things. And that's really what the education that's being presented is. It's not about, this is how you build a family. This is how you look after your kids. This is the kind of person that the qualities you should look for in a partner, and these kind of things that you might think would be a part of education. That I think the ideal person to teach relationship education would be somebody who has, celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary, has, 4 generations and no divorces in their family. I know people like that, and I think they'd have a lot of wisdom to share with people. And I really think that's what there should be in like relationship education, is speaking from people who are experts, not people who are just out of university working for some charity, and then spouting off the latest, new think.
But without going into details, the key figures in charge of the Scottish Government sex education materials, the ones I know about, let's just say their life isn't as you described it. Let's just say that, to say the least. But I think the absence of marriage is one of our major issues with the sex education resources. So, it's one of our core principles is promoting marriage for the good of the whole of society. And if that's not included in sex education, that's a message in itself, isn't it? If you teach this whole thing, you never mention. I would correct you though. I mean, it does mention marriage quite a lot, just only same-sex marriage.
Well, I say that with the regulations that have just come into effect, there are only 5 points in it, and where they must be taught. And the last one was the nature of marriage. It does say, and civil partnership and their importance for family life and the bringing up of children. But in the Department for Education guidance that was issued in September 2020, I couldn't find any reference at all to marriage. I may have blinked and missed it, but it certainly was not sort of front and center at all. So it was basically silence on this, which is outrageous.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. Just to conclude, I mean, the other thing as a political party ultimately that we can do about it is to vote and put people into the parliament to represent these views. We've got the electoral system that makes that a possibility. Just before I finish, just to say again, we've got a meeting tomorrow evening in Ayr, in the Market Inn. The Market Inn in Ayr, 7:30 p.m. tomorrow night. I'll be talking about the transgender guidance in school and some other things. We'll have some open discussion as well. Next week, Monday, Dumfries, Wednesday, Paisley, Thursday, Kirkcaldy. So keep your eye on our social media to see where we're going to be. It would be great to see you. So thanks to Phil, thanks to Susan, thanks to all for watching, thanks for your comments, and see you next week with Bernard Randall. Right, good night.
Yeah.